This is Casual Dan, and he doesn't believe in the zombie outbreak. This series will follow his day-to-day life. Day 1, he wakes up and has his morning breakfast, realizing after he is low on groceries and needs to pop out. He pulls up to the grocery store, grabs a few things including a chocolate cake slice, his mother's favourite. He goes to pay and shouts out to the shop assistant, but no answer, so he leaves the money and walks out. He is then jumped by a gang wanting to rob him. He manages to fight them off, get in his car and drive off. Close call. He pulls up to the cemetery where he sits at his mother's grave to enjoy the cake. However, a homeless guy attacks Dan. Again, he fights him off despite being hurt and proceeds to drive off home. Whilst he is reading his book, his house is attacked by burglars. He goes outside, renders them unconscious and drags them into the nearby woods to teach them a lesson. And after all that, he gets into bed to sleep. Day 2. He wakes up and has breakfast to gain energy for the day before heading out to the post office to grab a package. He arrives at the post office to find no one is working at the counter, so he decides to help himself, as he has been waiting for 3 weeks already. In the package is new headphones he had ordered. Stylish. As he leaves, a group of charity workers try to approach him. He pretends he can't hear them and drives off. It's time to visit the medical centre to treat his wounds from a homeless person bite yesterday. Seems a lot of people are sick today needing treatment. He decides with no one greeting him, he helps himself to what he needs. Healthcare should be free after all. On the way home, he decides to treat himself to some alcohol to relieve his stress. As he is paying, a drunk woman approaches him and tries to take his drink. He shoves her away and notices more drunks are appearing. He stumbles into the passenger door of his car to get away as quick as he can. Once he's home, he unwinds on the sofa watching TV whilst drinking, before stumbling to bed to go to sleep. Day 3. He wakes up and he's hungover from yesterday's drinking session. He decides to have breakfast outside to sober him up. When that cold air hits him, he remembers. He has a job interview at the bookstore and he's late. He runs to grab his bag, into the car and speeds off. But recklessly, he drives into a tree, but he still makes it to the bookstore. He runs into the building, however, no one is there. He starts shouting and suddenly the manager appears. However, it turns out he is a pervert and the interview was a trick, so he pushes him to the ground and runs away. He decides to go to church to talk about the trauma of what just happened, and he sits in a private room to wait. The priest turns up and immediately starts to grab Dan, in the process ripping off his clothes. Another perverted encounter, so he runs off half naked towards his car. He drives by a clothes store and sees an outfit he loves on a mannequin and purchases it before setting off home. Once he's home, he lays in bed reading holiday brochures. Dan needs to get away from this place, so he goes to sleep with a holiday in mind. Day 4. Today, he is going on holiday. The best Jet2 holiday deal to Hawaii he could get. So to get into the holiday spirit, he wants to buy a new outfit. First, he stops off for gas and loads up with snacks and comic books. Today is going to be a good day. He arrives at the clothes store and finds the perfect outfit. He's in a much better mood than yesterday, having to deal with perverts. So now he endures the 3-hour road trip and arrives at Brandenburg Airport. Dan is very excited. However, he finds out that Just Stop oil protests have closed the airstrip. Typical. He pushes them away from his car in anger and drives to an Airbnb he booked last minute. However, the owner was over-friendly and tried to touch him. Why does everyone want me, Dan ponders. So he resorts to sleeping in his car in a field. Day 5. After spending the night sleeping in his car, having his holiday ruined, he decides to head into the nearest town. He stumbles across a gas station, which has a bulletin board advertising a sporting country club. Now that sounds ideal. First off, he needs food, so heads to a diner, where he happens to spot his favourite car parked outside. He steps into the diner and it's deserted, but he notices food on the table. So his inner thoughts take over and he eats it and steals the rest before heading out. He takes one look at his old busted car, then heads over to the Mustang. The key has been left in the door. His bad streak continues. He steals the car, heads for the highway to test the car's speed. Things are finally looking up for Dan. Day 6. Dan wakes up on the road in the middle of the night after a car crash, with a splitting headache, fractured ribs, and isn't quite sure who or where he is. He's a bit delirious, so takes a nap till morning. He wakes up, deciding to drive, which he really shouldn't be doing, and ends up in a garden fence. He decides to walk and sees a stranger, who he asks for directions. However, they ignore him, so he flips them off and walks off. He stumbles down the road and a group start attacking him. This feels targeted, and he believes it's the Japanese mafia that are after him. So he finds a weapon in a nearby house, finds 2 Yakuza members and takes them out. He is now on the run, away from the Japanese mafia. He disappears into the woods and sits by a lake, pondering how he will start his new life in hiding. Day 6, Part 2. Dan is currently on the run from the Japanese mafia. He needs to hide and start a new life. Finding a disguise and a new place to live are now his priority. So he breaks into a house and eats a whole tub of ice cream. Not a priority, but for enjoyment. He then discovers a communications radio in the basement. He tries to reach out for anyone that can help.
Hey! Hey!
However, static is the only response. So he breaks into a nearby van and finds a generator in a garage. Now that'll be useful. Now for a disguise. In the neighbour's house he finds a dress to wear and dyes his hair. Perfect. No one will recognise him now. So he then sets off driving long and far through day and night until he stumbles across an abandoned building. This seems ideal. It's unfurnished, but it is remote. However, Dan, with no friends, family and money, must live a life in the shadows to survive. Day 7. Dan is still on the run from the Japanese mafia, so he gets a job in the general store under the guise of Dan Yao. He is in a dress after all. He uses the time in the store to overhear talk about the Japanese mafia. However, the people in this town tend to keep tight-lipped about everything, just a few grunts and moans. He also uses the store in a means to get supplies, slyly taking stuff like food, drink, fridges. However, on break, a helicopter heads towards his position. It's gotta be the mafia, so he runs to his vehicle. However, it's been compromised. He needs to get away, so he smashes a car window, causing a deep wound, but Dan doesn't care. He drives through the crowd. However, he can't go home and leave them back there, so he drives into woodland, where he finds some cabins, and sits there waiting anxiously. Day 7, Part 2. Dan is caught in a situation hiding from a Yakuza helicopter. He decides to try to find anything that he can to use to help. He comes across a hoodie, which will be perfect for concealing him. He then searches the rest of the cabins until an alarm is raised. This isn't good. Dan sprints to his car and drives off, but fortunately, the alarm has been a blessing, and the Japanese mafia seem to have lost his scent. He circles back to his van, where he takes out the Yakuza guard keeping watch. Then he drives back to his hideout, making sure no one was following. Dan is exhausted, and he uses his last bit of energy to place his new fridge, set up a calming fire, whilst eating some candy. Dan realises he needs to fortify his new home before anyone else finds where he is. Day 8. Dan is in a lot of pain due to his fractured ribs caused by the car crash a few days ago, but that's not going to stop him with his plan today. Dan has decided to steal from nearby neighbours to make his place feel like home. He parks up, using the fog as cover, crouch walking towards the victim's house. He steals a garden chair and slips it into his pocket. Once Dan is inside the building, he finds a black hoodie. This is better camouflage. It seems like the resident of this house is at work, so Dan takes the time to have a wash in someone else's bath before stealing their TV. Their bed also looks super comfy, so he decides to have a short nap in the middle of his burglary. Hopefully this isn't a bad idea. Day 8, Part 2. After waking up from a nap in the house he's robbing, he is a bit peckish, so he prepared himself a burger for a snack. Luckily, no one has come home yet. On the table is their diary. Of course, Dan has to read it, but it turns out Jeff, who lives here, seems to be a stalker. It's full of women's names and their daily schedules. Jeff is a freak. It's time to get out of here, especially as Dan is in a dress, so he gets back into his van and arrives back home. Dan sets up his TV and chair, and luckily, Dean's Survival is on TV. Dan has a crush on Dean, who teaches him some skills with his wood. Carpentry is fun. As nighttime approaches, Dan realises he has no bed, so he has to sleep on the floor tonight. Day 9. Dan couldn't sleep last night. He kept having nightmares about stalker Jeff, who he robbed from yesterday. So he decides to go report his findings about Jeff to the police today. But when he arrives there, no police force are present in the station. So he takes some water and searches out back, where he finds a pistol. He's never shot a gun before, so he takes it. As he leaves, a drugged up woman starts smashing the window and startles Dan. She ends up breaking through and tries to eat Dan. He is a tasty snack after all, but he pushes her down and runs out back, pulls out the gun, loads it and points at the door. Suddenly, a person breaks through and Dan instantly takes shots. However, this isn't the woman, it's an innocent person. He runs out the station and throws the gun to the floor. However, he likes this power. He can take what he wants with this. So he gets in his van, goes to the nearest burger store, demands 3 burgers and shoots the workers. Proceeds to go out back, makes a burger and eats it in front of the corpses. Proper power move. Before heading back home, turning on the stove and taking a seat thinking where this power can take him. Day 10. Dan has nothing but bloodthirst on his mind after yesterday's antics, but something's missing. So he heads out and stops at a bar. Alcohol. That's what's missing. He bursts through the door and shoots both people inside, before heading behind the bar to down a whole bottle of alcohol, and then smoking a cigar over the dead corpses, like some taunt to the dead. He notices a jukebox which he takes to spruce up his place. then heads over to the neighbouring house, downing another bottle of alcohol. The door's locked, so he tries to shoot it open before deciding to smash the window. The resident of this house heard the ruckus and came over, banging on the locked door. Dan just stood there eating a jar of nacho cheese, staring him dead in the eye, before unlocking the door and taking him out. Dan then strips him naked and leaves him on the porch, shoots the neighbours that heard the commotion, then stared at the deceased loved one screaming through the door window, as Dan just leaves her to suffer the loss that he caused. Dan then nips over to the laundrette to wash the blood off his clothes and have a cigar whilst waiting. Day 10, Part 2. Dan needs to acquire better guns and more ammo. His father owns a military resource shop just outside of town. His best bet is there. Maybe his father can keep him safe as well. So Dan gets up and in his drunken state, walks all over glass, barefoot. A deep wound on each foot, this isn't good. He needs to stitch this up immediately. So Dan grabs his clothes, stumbles to his van and drives to a nearby doctor. Dan decides to climb through the window of the doctor's. He equips his crowbar and beats the doctor to death. He could have been Yakuza undercover and tried to drug Dan. Best to be safe than sorry. He stumbles around looking for a sewing kit, but instead finds a pickle, so he eats the doctor's pickle. Finally, he finds a sewing kit, but he naps first to make sure he's in the best frame of mind to do it. Once he wakes, Dan gets straight into stitching his wounds, and then stumbles to the van to go to his father's store. On the way, he stops at a church, and uses his remaining bullets to kill a priest. Revenge for when a priest touched him a few days ago. Now off to his father's store. Day 11. Dan arrives at his father's military store. However, the door is locked. Dan goes through the window. The store is eerily quiet, and all the ammo seems to have been wiped from the store. He starts grabbing some clothing at least, but a window smashes behind him. The Japanese mafia are here. He takes one out and decides to leave as he's in no state to fight. However, they have ambushed him at the vehicle, and no matter how hard he tries, he can't fight them off. He runs to the vehicle only to be attacked from behind and eventually taken out. Dan's time is over, for him to eternally spend roaming as something he never believed in. Or is it really over?